Welcome back to the deep dive. We're jumping straight into some really pressing global challenges today, looking at how things connect, things you might not expect.
Yeah, it makes you think. I was reminded of Ursula K. Le Guin. She wrote, "The unread story is not a story. It is little black marks on wood pulp. The reader makes it a story."
That's a great quote for this.
Feels relevant, doesn't it? These global crises, they aren't just numbers or headlines. They're stories, narratives we really need to understand and sort of piece together.
Absolutely. And our way into this story today is through a really critical piece published recently in the Indian Express. Now, for many of you listening, especially if you're tackling current affairs for exams like the UPSC, you know how crucial this kind of analysis is.
Oh, definitely.
It pulls together these huge topics, conflict, climate change, international bodies, into one sort of interconnected picture. It's fundamental stuff.
It really is. It goes beyond just the daily news cycle and forces you to look at the underlying systems, right? It's the kind of thinking you need for mains, sharpens things for prelims too. But honestly, it's important for anyone just trying to make sense of the world today.
Couldn't agree more. So our mission today is pretty clear. Let's unpack the key insights from this source material. We want to help you get a handle on the current global situation, the intense pressures, and the big debates about how systems like the UN can even cope.
Where do we start?
Okay, let's dive in. And I think we have to start with the tough reality, the sheer scale of global conflict right now.
Yeah, that's really the backdrop for everything else.
Yeah.
The source points out something pretty sobering.
Yeah.
Global conflict levels are, right now, the highest they've been since the end of World War II.
Since World War II, I mean, just for context, we're talking about estimates of 70, maybe 85 million deaths back then. So hitting conflict levels not seen since that era, that's a serious wake-up call.
It really is.
What are the current numbers looking like, say, for 2024?
They're stark. The source mentions 56 active conflicts globally. But maybe even more telling is that 92 countries are involved in conflicts outside their own borders.
92 countries. So it's incredibly widespread.
Hugely widespread. It's not just internal issues anymore. And the direct human cost. Just this year, over 233,000 people killed in these conflicts.
Just staggering. And that's the direct deaths, but the ripple effect, the displacement.
Oh, absolutely massive. The source talks about a displacement crisis. More than 120 million people forced from their homes globally.
120 million.
Yeah, because of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights abuses. It's almost impossible to properly visualize that number. Whole populations just uprooted.
And then there's the money, the sheer cost of all this violence.
It's astronomical. The calculation for 2023, the global economic impact of violence, was $19.3 trillion.
Hold on, $19.3 trillion. Can you put that in perspective? What does that actually mean?
Okay, so that figure, it's about 13.5% of the entire global GDP.
13.5%.
Yeah. Think about that. Over an eighth of everything the world produces, economically speaking, is being effectively consumed by violence and its containment.
Wow.
It puts this huge strain on government budgets, money that could go to health, education, development. It scares off investment. And crucially, it messes with supply chains, causes instability that fuels inflation, which, let's face it, affects everyone, everywhere. It's a massive destabilizing force.
That really sets a grim stage. But here's where the article pivots to something I think many people, myself included, don't automatically connect. The link between all this conflict and, climate change.
Yeah, this is a really critical connection the source makes, and it's kind of alarming how they feed each other. We tend to think of climate change as, an environmental issue, maybe an economic one.
Right.
But conflicts are actively accelerating it.
Yeah.
We know global CO2 emissions are still rising, projected 41.6 gigatons this year, up from 40.6 last year. The trend is still upwards.
And conflicts are a significant part of that rise. How so?
Surprisingly big. The source highlights the carbon footprint just from military activities worldwide, just the general running of militaries, peacetime operations, etc.
Oh, okay.
That alone is estimated at around 5.5% of total global emissions.
5.5% just from militaries. That's huge. If you treated the world's armed forces as a single country.
It would be the fourth largest emitter on the planet.
Fourth largest. Why isn't this talked about more?
That's exactly the point the article raises.
Yeah.
And, it gets even worse because that 5.5% figure, the source argues it often doesn't even properly account for the emissions from the actual fighting.
What do you mean the actual fighting, like beyond just running the tanks and planes?
Exactly. Think about the direct damage. Bombing cities requires massive reconstruction, which is hugely carbon intensive. Shelling forests or fields causes massive fires, releasing stored carbon.
Okay, I see.
Damage to ecosystems, destruction of infrastructure that then needs rebuilding, all these direct consequences of combat often aren't fully captured in standard military emission reporting. So the true climate cost, probably way higher than even that 5.5%.
That completely reframes it. The article gives some specific examples too, right? And they are pretty shocking.
They really drive it home. Take the Russia-Ukraine war. Since it started, the estimated emissions generated are around 230 million tons of CO2.
230 million tons. And the source gives a comparison. That's like the combined annual emissions of Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia.
Exactly. From just one conflict. And even within that, you can break it down. Like landscape fires caused by the fighting, that alone was about 49 million tons.
Wow.
Plus, think about the forest burned over 150,000 hectares mentioned.
And burning forests is a double whammy, isn't it? Releases carbon and destroys the trees that would absorb it.
Precisely. Kills off a vital carbon sink. And it's not just Ukraine. There's data emerging from other conflicts too.
Right.
The Israel and Hamas conflict, just in the first 120 days. The estimated emissions were somewhere between 420,000 and 650,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, give or take.
In just 4 months.
In just 4 months. And that figure, even at the low end, exceeds the entire annual emissions of 26 individual countries or territories.
Good grief. These examples just make it crystal clear. Conflict isn't just a human tragedy or an economic drain. It's a major environmental accelerator, actively undermining climate goals.
And when you pull back the lens again, this whole the conflict, the resources it burns, the climate impact, it directly restricts progress on something really fundamental, the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
The UN's blueprint for, a better world.
Right. How does conflict specifically derail the SDGs?
Well, the link is tragically obvious in many ways. The source points out globally 1.1 billion people live in poverty across 112 countries. But a huge chunk of those 218 million people live specifically in conflict-affected countries.
So conflict is a poverty trap.
Absolutely. It doesn't just halt development. It actively reverses it. Destroys infrastructure, disrupts education, wrecks healthcare systems.
Yeah, it's not just about lack of income, it's the collapse of basic service.
Exactly. The article gives some really grim examples. Yemen, after 8 years of war, only 54% of health facilities are fully functional. Imagine trying to run a health system like that.
Impossible. Or Sudan.
Sudan, yeah.
Okay.
In 2023, 15 million people couldn't access basic water, sanitation, hygiene facilities because of the conflict. These are absolute fundamentals for human life and dignity.
And the long-term economic hit.
Immense. Look at northeastern Nigeria. Between 2008 and 2021, the estimated economic loss due to conflict was somewhere between $91 and $113 billion.
Billion with a B.
Billion with a B. These aren't abstract numbers. They're shattered livelihoods, broken economies, development goals, just pushed back decades.
So this inevitably leads us to the institution created precisely to stop this kind of thing. The United Nations. Set up after World War II, 1945, explicitly aiming for peace. Built on those 4 pillars, right? Peace and security, human rights, rule of law development.
And given everything we've just discussed, the rising conflicts, the climate links, the SDG setbacks, it's no surprise the UN is under intense scrutiny. People are asking, quite fairly, is it effective? Can it handle today's crises? Is it, fit for purpose anymore?
That scrutiny is essential. But the source is careful to balance that. It also highlights the UN's real achievements. It's not all failure, is it?
No, far from it. And often the successes are less visible, quieter. The UN was key in getting the Paris Agreement done in 2015, still our main global framework for climate action.
Yeah.
It set up the World Food Program, still the biggest humanitarian agency out there, literally saving lives daily.
And it's not just about crisis response, but also rebuilding after conflict.
Definitely. The source mentions bodies like the UNDP helping countries get back on their feet. It cites Liberia as an example supporting the economy, boosting entrepreneurship, rebuilding infrastructure after their devastating civil war.
And the peacekeeping missions. They get a lot of criticism, but do they have positive impacts?
They do, despite the very real challenges they face. They help countries build stronger institutions, develop policies, train leaders. And interestingly, the source notes they're paying more attention now to their own environmental impact.
Oh, really?
Promoting better environmental stewardship within their missions, using more renewable energy, trying to practice what they preach, essentially.
That point about peacekeeping, sometimes even helping the environment in host countries, was fascinating. Seems counterintuitive.
It does, but some studies suggest that by providing stability, peacekeeping can actually create the space needed for environmental protection efforts to resume, things that were impossible during active fighting.
Makes sense.
And crucially, that improves security, real or perceived, lets economies start functioning again. The source mentions UNDP microfinance in South Sudan, helping local trade restart. So yeah, the UN faces huge hurdles, but it demonstrably can make a positive difference.
But that capacity is clearly under strain. Which brings us to the core argument in the source material, the urgent need for systemic reform at the UN.
Yeah, this is the crux of it. The fundamental problem, as the article lays it out, is the UN structure. It relies on its member states, right? But too often, decisions and actions end up reflecting the narrow interests of the most powerful states, not some neutral application of international law for the collective good.
And we've seen very clear examples of that recently, haven't we?
Absolutely. The source points directly to the gridlock over the Israel-Hamas conflict and the Russia-Ukraine war. In both cases, the veto power held by the permanent members of the Security Council was used to block resolutions.
Even when most other countries agreed on them.
Exactly. Powerful nations using the veto to shield themselves or their allies, basically paralyzing the council. It's a long-standing criticism, but these recent examples have really sharpened it.
So what specific reforms does the source suggest to tackle these deep-rooted issues?
Well, one major proposal goes right after the veto power itself, limiting it.
Limiting the veto, how would that actually work in practice?
The idea proposed is to have a kind of nonpartisan panel review any decision where a veto is cast.
Yeah.
This panel would then have to publicly report on the reasons behind the veto, and critically, its likely global consequences.
Ah, so transparency as a deterrent.
Kind of. The hope is that forcing powerful nations to justify their vetoes openly, beyond just saying national interest, might push them towards more responsible actions. Maybe make them think twice before blocking consensus, especially when it goes against agreed international norms.
Interesting idea. What about the Security Council's structure itself? The criticism is often that it reflects the world of 1945, not today.
Exactly. The permanent 5 members are the victors of WWII, essentially. The reform proposal discussed is about expansion, bringing major developing countries, the source mentions Brazil, India, South Africa specifically, into permanent membership.
Making it more representative.
Yes, and also giving a voice to groups like small island developing states. They're disproportionately hit by climate change, a major security threat, yet have almost no say in the Security Council currently. The overall aim is a more balanced, democratic, and ultimately more effective council by shifting power away from just those 5 permanent members.
And connecting back to the climate issue, is there a reform proposed for those military emissions we talked about?
Yes, and it's a crucial one. The source highlights a big loophole. Under the main UN climate treaty, the UNFCCC, reporting military emissions is voluntary.
Voluntary. Seriously?
Yeah, so many countries just don't report them, or the data is patchy. The proposal is simple. Make it mandatory. Compel countries to disclose their military emissions fully. And then the next step would be to set global decarbonization targets specifically for the defense sector. You can't manage what you don't measure, right?
Right. Makes sense. And finally, there's always the issue of money, or lack of it. Underfunding.
It plagues the UN constantly. Impacts everything: peacekeeping, climate resilience work, humanitarian aid delivery. The article makes a strong plea for member states, particularly the big economies, to actually meet their financial commitments and pay on time.
Just pay their dues.
Exactly. And beyond that, encourage more voluntary contributions, maybe specifically targeted at development in regions facing that triple threat: conflict, climate impacts, and poverty.
So it's structural changes, financial changes, but the source also suggests something deeper is needed, a shift in mindset.
Yeah, it brings in this interesting philosophical idea, operating behind a veil of ignorance.
Okay, what's that?
It's from political philosophy, basically suggesting that the fairest decisions are made when you don't know what your own position or self-interest will be in the outcome.
Like making rules without knowing if you'll be rich or poor, powerful or weak?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Applied to the UN, it's asking nations to try and make decisions based not on what's best for us right now, but on what's the fairest possible outcome for everyone. It's about aiming for collective fairness, acting without immediate bias, even when it's hard.
That's asking a lot, a huge mental shift. But maybe that's what's needed. Okay, let's bring this back home for you listening, whether you're studying for UPSC or just trying to stay informed.
I think the key takeaway is understanding these connections, seeing how conflict isn't just over there, but it fuels climate change here, It holds back development everywhere, and it puts immense strain on the international systems we rely on. That interconnected view is crucial for current affairs analysis.
Absolutely. It's essential for that analytical thinking needed for exams, but also just for being an engaged citizen in this complex world. So this deep dive, drawing on that Indian Express piece, was really about giving you a structured way into these tangled issues. We've looked at the alarming rise in conflict, its huge human and economic costs. We've explored that surprising, significant link to climate change emissions. We've discussed the UN, its vital work, but also its very real struggles, and we've outlined those specific reforms being debated for its future.
And maybe here's a final thought, something to mull over, stemming from all this. In a world where crises seem to be speeding up and weaving together ever more tightly, can our international institutions like the UN realistically change fast enough to keep up?
That's the big question.
And what does that idea of collective fairness really demand from individual nations when they have powerful tools like the veto and strong competing interests?
Really important questions to reflect on. We certainly hope this discussion has given you some valuable insights and things to think about. If you found this deep dive helpful, please do give it a like, subscribe for more explorations like this, and we'd love to hear your thoughts or any questions you might have in the comments below.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
Thanks so much for joining us on the deep dive.
Thank you for diving deep with us.